And so, okay, we're looking at being discerning, right? Being discerning about stuff. We're looking about being responsible, because as we are saved, our life changes away from sin, yes, but as we're saved, it also changes away from irresponsibility. Being a Christian, it's not that you should just be working; it's that you should be working with your whole heart. There's something that changes there. You become a good worker rather than showing up late to the job drunk. There's something that changes there. Um, Other areas of responsibility back before you were saved, you were goofing off and doing drugs, and you always smelled like sweat and pee. Well, then as you get saved, you start taking showers, you stop doing drugs, you smell differently, your house smells different. For those of you who have been on drugs, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's that odor that's not there anymore. Things like that where you aren't just turning away from sin as a Christian, you also grow and become less irresponsible. And I've actually seen time and time again where people are unable to make the switch of learning to be responsible, and they either go back to, they walk away from their faith, or they just kind of reach a stagnant place in their faith. So our private life definitely affects our spiritual development, okay? And as, if you become responsible in one area, you're going to find an increase of responsibility in the other area. Tell me honestly that you're going to be able to read the Bible every single day when you are an irresponsible person. This is not going to happen. Like, if every single day, it's going to affect the other areas. Eventually, you're either going to stop reading the Bible, or you're going to get responsible in other areas. Like, it's just something that has to happen. So that's kind of what we've been looking at in Colossians. And now the tone of the letter, the idea kind of changes, okay? Everything that we looked at to this point was just the introduction to Colossians, which was chapter 1, verses 1 14. Well, now we get into the theology of the book. Now, theology, if you don't know, theology is a big fancy word which basically just means what you believe. That's it. Okay? It comes from two Greek words, theos, God, and logos, the study of. Okay? That's it. So theology is the study of God. It's what you believe. That's it. Sounds all whoopity, but it's really not. So he goes straight from there. He was talking about in verse 14, if you remember, he was talking about the different things that Jesus does, and that takes him straight into a discussion of who Jesus is. So this is where we get to the theology of the what to believe. And so we'll call this part Jesus at the center. And it goes from verse 15 through 20. You can see the breakdown here. Introduction, we looked at that. It was 3 parts long. I just kind of narrowed it down into one heading. That way we have more space here. So now we're in the second part of the letter, theology, and that's going to go through all of chapter 1 and 2 pretty much, and then we're going to get into the ethics part, which we'll get that, and that's going to be a couple months down the road. That's going to be pretty much in chapter 3. So, okay, Jesus is at the center. And the thing is here, we're looking at battling false beliefs, false doctrines, false theology, battling heresy, that kind of idea. And it's important for them to start acting more like Christians, more like Christ, if they correct their beliefs first. Okay? The two are linked. So that takes us to Colossians 1, 15 through 20. He being Jesus, remember this is a continuation of verse 14, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Now, he's going to later talk about in the book what some of these thrones and dominions are. But for right now, he's just kind of mentioning it, okay? So don't get ahead of him. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have first place in everything. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So if you'll remember, back at the beginning of the month, we were talking about the way that in large part the Colossian heresy, the things that they were believing that wasn't right, that wasn't true, had to do with Jesus not being fully God and not being fully human. And these are ideas that still persist even to today. Jesus only appeared to be a person. He wasn't really God. He was a lesser God. He wasn't equal with the Father. Different things like that. I mean, you see it repeated over and over again. Jehovah's Witnesses is actually believe something very similar to that. So let's look at it. Now, this section, verse 15 through 20, is broken up into two sections. The first section is Jesus is over creation. That's 15, 16, and 17. And then Jesus over the church is 18, 19, and 20. So this first part, Jesus over creation. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So we're going to talk about Jesus here in more cosmic terms, okay? More eternal terms. Later, we're going to talk about it in more immediate terms. But for right now, we're just talking about cosmic terms. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. So what does that mean? Well, first off, the Father is invisible. God the Father is invisible, okay? But Jesus is his exact representation, okay? He is the physical manifestation of the invisible God the Father. There's no other way of saying that. He is the image of the invisible God, okay? Literal, not like a lesser, not like a copy, like not like a copy in the sense that we use it where there was the original and then a copy was made, but a copy in the sense of both being, they are both fully God. Okay, no other really way I know of how to say that, but Jesus is the exact representation of the Father. So then it takes us to this word here, this firstborn situation, and that's where things get a little bit complicated. So anytime you have two different languages, there's going to be a little bit of hard time kind of rectifying the two, a hard time translating, because there's no such thing as a one-for-one equivalent. It doesn't matter what we're talking about, it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. This is why I actually stopped telling people that there's literal Bible translations, because there is no such thing as a literal translation. Anytime you're dealing with a language, there's going to be some areas for flux and some things that they understood differently. So when you say it's a literal translation, it's a little bit misleading. There's no real literal Bible translation. There's some that probably get the idea a little bit better and some that probably get the idea a little bit worse. And that's kind of the most, line in the sand that you can really get. And it's getting more and more complicated the more we understand about Greek and that kind of stuff. So long story short here is the word firstborn, prototokos, is like most words, it has different contexts, and those different contexts that it's used in has, a different meaning. And English does the same thing, okay? Let me think of a word that English does the same thing on. Run. Run can mean when you physically move your legs, okay? Run can also mean when you start a program on a computer. It has, depending on the context, it means two different things. And so we kind of have the same thing in English. So it's nothing real crazy there. Here, what he's talking about, the firstborn over all creation, what that means is it means the first in rank. The idea here is kind of like how the eldest son in ancient times kind of had authority in the family unit. It's the same kind of idea here. Jesus is the first in the rank. He's the firstborn over all creation. He's the head, the authority over the creation. That would be a good way of saying it. Now, this same word is also going to be used in the second half of these verses, closer to around verse 18 or 19. And the reason for that is because it mirrors some of the language and some of the spacing, if you know anything about poetry. And that's because this section is commonly called the Christ hymn or the Christ poem. It was likely a song that the early church, or maybe some form of litany that the early church used. And so that's this whole section that we're looking at tonight. So how do we know that this doesn't mean the first created over all creation? How do we know that created over all creation? Because maybe, as some teach, maybe Jesus is fully God, but only because God the Father created him to be a copy of him, and that he was God's first creation, and then he went on and created everything else. There's actually a lot who believe that kind of stuff. So how do we know that it doesn't mean that Jesus was created? Well, there's primarily two reasons from Colossians. There's a lot of other reasons, but I'm only going to mention the two from Colossians. The very next verse says everything was created by him. It's going to be very, very difficult for Jesus to have been created if he had to exist in order to be created. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can't say that he was created when he was the one that did the creating. That's like the whole, which came first, the chicken or the egg. So right there in the very next verse, we're going to know that that means that Jesus was not created. And then you get to, we're not going to look here tonight, but in the future we will. Chapter 2, verse 9 says, the entire fullness of God's nature dwells bodily in Christ. That means that Christ is literally God, which means, okay, so if he's God, that means he can't be lesser, he can't have been created, because God has no beginning and no end by nature. If you have something that is created, it doesn't matter how powerful it is not, it is not God. Satan is a powerful being, but he's not God. He has had a creation point. So that takes us to verse 16. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and the invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So that brings up a very important question that a lot of times people ask. Who did the creating? The Father or Jesus? So you can't say that God had no part of it, but a lot of times people have a really hard time with this. And the idea is there's a few different things. First off, they have the same nature. The Father and the Son, they have the same nature. There's no rivalry, there's no competition here. It's not like us where, me and Chuck are both gunning for a position of, getting a raise at work or something like that. It's not like that. They had the same nature. Okay, they saw eye to eye on things, if you want to say it that way. Second off, what is attributed to one is in some ways attributed to all three. Okay, in some ways, not in all ways, but in some ways. A good example of this is in the book of Zechariah. Talking of God the Father, it says that he was the one who was pierced. And then he goes on to mention the Son being pierced. So from that kind of perspective, yes, they both can be attributed to that. Also, there was this idea in the ancient world, which we don't really have nowadays too much, is if you did something in the name of your boss, it was the boss who did it. Does that kind of make sense? Like if you did it in a family unit. If you did something that brought your family honor, the honor would go to your father and his household. Okay? It wasn't you weren't a lone island. And so in that way, also you could say that, yes, both of them. And then there's another little aspect of this whole thing. You could summarize all of this and say it a lot clearer by just saying this. The Father created through Jesus. That would be a perfectly accurate way of summarizing the issue. Everything was created through Jesus, so the Father did it through Jesus. So it might seem like semantics, but it really isn't. Everything then is dependent on him. For everything was created by him in heaven and on earth, the visible and invisible. It goes through things. All things have been created through him and also for him. So everything is dependent on him, created by him, and he is over them. He is the head of creation, which is why it said he was a firstborn over creation. So, firstborn, first in rank, that's the first verse. Father created through the Son, that's the second verse. That takes us to verse 17. He is before all things, and by him all things hold together. So that sounds like a real simple idea, but we're going to have to do some what the hit public speakers and pastors call unpacking. So let's unpack some things. So the idea here is that Jesus existed before them and sustains it. This is apart from what he did on the cross. The cross wasn't the point where he became the focal point that was holding it all together. From the moment that everything began to exist, he was the one holding it together. And that brings up a very important doctrinal issue. And for some of you, you might not care. So I'll say it for the ones who do care. It's the question, was Jesus eternally begotten? If you're familiar with, I think it's the Nicene Creed, for instance, they talk about Jesus being eternally begotten. And the idea there, if you don't know what eternally begotten means, another way of saying it is, was Jesus always the Son? Now, traditionally, Christian doctrine says, yes, he was eternally begotten. I, however, say no, and I'll kind of explain what I mean. First off, Jesus has always been who he is. He's always been the second person of the Trinity. That's not the thing that I'm saying, okay? So Jesus has always been the second person of the Trinity. There wasn't a time when he wasn't that. He didn't suddenly become, okay? But in Hebrews and other parts, it says, today I have begotten you, which means that there was a moment in time, a point in history when he became something that he was not. He became the Son. And so when we can look at history and say, okay, when did that happen? When did Jesus become the Son? When is it true that there was a day that God had begotten Jesus? When did that happen in history? When we can look and we say, okay, well, when he was born of the Virgin Mary, he became fully human. So he was literally born of God. So that verse doesn't make sense if you say that he's eternally begotten, but it does make sense if you say, okay, Jesus wasn't eternally begotten. He was born of the Father when he came to live on earth. Now, this is a point of major contention. Maybe you don't care, but there's a lot of different Christian teachers who are very much so very opinionated about this, and well, I feel like it's something that's not really based on fact, because if Jesus is eternally begotten, that by necessity means that he must be eternally being created by the Father. It's a paradox. If you say that Jesus is eternally begotten, think about this. You're literally saying that since there wasn't a specific historical time when he became the Son, the Father has always been creating him as his Son. And so you still have him existing forever, but it doesn't make much sense. It's a paradox. So then the question becomes, okay, so if Jesus was not eternally begotten, then how come the Bible sometimes talks about him like before his birth references him as Jesus the Son? Well, that's because it's writing to the New Testament writers were writing to a church that knew him as Jesus the Son. See, in the Old Testament, the Trinity wasn't revealed fully. It was something that was hidden from the Jews. And that's one of the things that the New Testament actually talks about, is the way that Jesus was revealed to us. So in the New Testament, it talks about his activity before his birth as Jesus the Son, because they're trying to avoid confusion. Hey, this is who you know him as. He wasn't called that back then. Does anybody know what Jesus was called in the Old Testament? Nobody? Yahweh. He was called Yahweh. And in fact, in the book of Mark, at the very beginning of the book, it says, he's telling the whole prophecy, prepare ye the way of the Lord. That word there is translating the Hebrew word Yahweh. So from the very beginning of the gospel, Jesus is referred to as Yahweh. He's not referred to as like some other God. He is referred to as Yahweh. So that finishes the section talking about Jesus over creation. Now we get to the second half of the verse, where now he's going to shift focus. So Jesus over all creation, and he's going to point it down to Jesus over the church specifically. And that's going to take us to verse 18, 19, and 20. So this is what 18 says. It says, he is also the head of the body, the church. As he is, he created everything and all that. He's also the head of the body of the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead. Here we have the firstborn repeated again. So that he might come to have first place in everything. So there's a lot of things that people kind of misunderstand about Christ, and this verse really helps unpack that. And so first off, it says that he's over the church. That means it says he's the head of the body of the church. What that means is that Christ is over the church. He is their superior, or our superior. He is the decision maker. He's the ruler. He's the source of the church. He's the author and finisher of our faith. He began the church. He started this whole thing. So he's the source. He's its boss. That means he's over me too. And that what you mean? And that's what that means is as I'm living my life, and as I'm serving in ministry, as I'm doing these things, I have to constantly say, am I honoring my boss? Right? Am I working to the Lord like he would have me to do? And, that's something that we always have to weigh our conscience against, and I'm not just talking about, I'm talking about everybody, from pastors to worship leaders to the janitors. Every Christian has to reach a point of weighing what they're doing to, is this honoring to God? Is this accurately reflecting what Christ is wanting? So he began not just the cosmos, but he also began our faith. He began the church, which brings us to the second use here of the firstborn. the firstborn from the dead. Now, what on earth does that mean? Well, if you try to apply the same meaning we had before, you're going to be a little bit confused. He is the first in rank of the dead. What does that mean? He's leading an army of the dead? It sounds like some kind of a fantasy movie. But we also know that it doesn't mean first created, because obviously that doesn't make sense. The first created from the dead, that's nonsense. That doesn't make sense. But we can also know that there's another idea that firstborn can be used. So here, it doesn't mean first created, as that wouldn't make sense. And in fact, I do have to mention this. The Jehovah's Witnesses actually teach that Greek words only have one meaning. So anytime there's a translation, they try and dog it and say, okay, it has to rigidly always be. That's not accurate. If you don't believe me, I encourage you, learn Greek yourself. Do the studying yourself. Translate it for yourself. You'll see the same words used drastically different. Drastically different. So, here, what firstborn means, first of those who would be resurrected from the dead. He was the first one to do it, if that makes sense. Not that he was the first person raised from the dead. You'll remember Lazarus, okay? He was the first to experience the resurrection that came as a process of Christ coming. See, because Christ came and he lived and he died, he did all that. He was resurrected from the dead and given the resurrected body. He was the first of that for that to happen. Lazarus was raised from the dead. He wasn't given a resurrected body. So when that happened, okay, and Jesus was resurrected, this was to show us what would happen to us too. So in the same way that it happened to him, it's going to happen to us too. That's why it says he's the firstborn from the dead, because we will also be resurrected from the dead. And so that takes us to the last bit, so that he might come to have first place in everything. And here's the thing about all of this, is that Jesus' life and death and resurrection, it wasn't just another event, it was the event. You could call it the focal point of all history. Christ, who now reigns over the church, will reign over all. Right? His kingdom will endure. We don't see it come to completion yet. This is what I was talking about last week when I said the already but not yet principle. Paul uses it all the time. So does Christ reign? Is he superior? Yes. Do we see it yet? No. Already, but not yet. So Christ, who now reigns over the church, will reign over all. His work on the cross, it set in motion the coming kingdom. All history shifts on what happened at the cross. At the beginning of time, everything was looking forward to the cross around the whole globe. The pain and suffering that people were enduring. Well, then Christ came, and now we're seeing everything working towards the grand finale. It's not about the different kingdoms that are coming. It's not about Russia's war with Ukraine. It's not about any of these things. It's not about politics. Everything is leading towards the climax of Jesus' second coming, where his kingdom will be a seen reality. A seen reality. It's already a reality, but it's not seen. So then that takes us to verse 19, which says this. So, okay, firstborn in the beginning there, it was the first in rank, but here it's being used as the first in order. First in an order of things. He was the first to have the resurrected body. So that takes us to verse 19, which says, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. So this verse sounds a little bit confusing, because it sounds like the Father's just like, this is going to make me happy. And so I'm going to go ahead and let Jesus do that. Or maybe I'm just going to tell Jesus to do that, and he's just going to have to deal with it. Because that's how we think. And so it's a little bit hard, so let's kind of break this apart. There's two things I want to talk about here. First thing is we see that Jesus was not an emanation of God. Okay, another way of saying that is a Buddha or an avatar of the divine spark. He wasn't an emanation of the divine spark. He himself was fully God. Okay, there's a lot of people that actually teach that Jesus was a Buddha, one of the enlightened ones, but nothing more. And that's definitely not what this is saying. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. All of his godness was in Jesus. Okay, all of it. Which means that Jesus was fully God. This is not an emanation we're talking about. This is God in flesh. So you're seeing, once again, you're seeing him kind of combating that Colossian idea that Jesus wasn't fully God and wasn't fully human. We're seeing absolutely he was. And that's the main argument that Paul is trying to make here. So he himself was fully God, and he was also fully God while on earth. Okay? If you're reading through these things, you see that absolutely is what's going on. God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him. The question being, when? When was God pleased to do this? Think about it. For God was pleased to have all, okay, so Jesus is fully God. What we do is we say, okay, this is talking about from the beginning of time. No, we're not talking about Jesus over the creation anymore. We're talking about Jesus over the church. And Jesus wasn't created. We just looked at that in verse 16. Everything was created through him. He was not created. So then the question has to be, when did this happen? When was God pleased to do this? Well, if we look back at verses 15 through 17, he already showed us Jesus' godhood before his humanity. Before he ever came to the earth, we already saw that he was God. So he was fully God before, but the Godhead, okay, which is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, was in agreement of his taking on human nature when he was on earth. Rest in flesh. So when was God pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him? When he was born of the Virgin Mary. He was pleased for God himself to fully become flesh and come to live in this life. So you see right here, we have the conclusion of Paul's, not really the conclusion, more the tie-in of Paul's argument that, okay, I've just shown you about how Jesus is fully God. He's always been God, he always will be. And now we're talking about how he's over the church and how he was fully human. So we have Paul saying a lot of really important things in a very small place. So he says, right here. All his fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So because God became flesh, he was able to reconcile us to God. If Jesus wasn't God, he couldn't have reconciled us. The reason why he had to be fully human was because people are the ones who sinned against God. But I can die in the place of one of you, and that won't forgive your sins. It's only a wicked person being punished, right? It had to be someone who was perfect. Well, there are no people who are perfect. We're born in sin, and we live in sin. Ergo, we had to have God, the one himself who was wronged, stood in our place and died for us because he was the only one who could. Therefore, he had to fully be God. But he also had to fully be human in order to die for our cause. See what I mean? So here you have the whole crux of it resting on that. So because God became flesh, he was able to reconcile us to God. Which means a few things. First off, what that means is that there's no need for our works to supplement. There's no reason for us to add to it. Like, we're saved, but we still have to do a couple to-do lists before we die. Otherwise, we're not going to make it. We have to supplement it. We have to, be good enough or do all the right things. And then the second thing is, well, let's take, for instance, baptism, water baptism. Water baptism, is it something that we're commanded to do? Yes? Yes? Okay. What happens if you're saved and then you die? See, our works don't save us. Water baptism doesn't save us. Water baptism is something that we do to obey God. It's not something that saves us. It's something we do out of obedience. There's a complete difference there. There are many churches, even today, that teach salvation by works. So you have to do these things in order to be saved. So if somebody's on their deathbed and they accept Christ, you better get something to sprinkle over them real fast, which is funny because the Greek word baptizo, which is where we get baptism from, means to submerge, to go under. So sprinkling water doesn't make a whole lot of sense because the word literally is submerge. So obviously, what I'm saying here isn't that you have to take somebody who's dying and throw them underwater. My point is that water baptism doesn't save us. We don't have to supplement the work that Christ did. But it also means that our actions must be submitted to Christ. So since Jesus was fully God, we don't have to do the works. However, our actions must be submitted to Christ. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Since Jesus was fully human, we don't have to add works. I said that backwards. But because Jesus was fully God, our actions must be submitted to Christ. We can't just live however we want. Oh, well, I'm already saved. Nothing's going to change that, so I can just do whatever I want. No. And that's what was happening in the Colossian church. People were going to the different extremes. Very unhelpful. And typically, you're going to find that going to the extremes is usually unhelpful. And one more thing that's worth mentioning is that it doesn't say that Jesus was reconciled to us. It doesn't say that God was reconciled to us. This is a very important point. It says very clearly that we were reconciled to God. We were the ones that were wrong. We were the ones that had to be turned around. Does that make sense? We were reconciled to God. A very important part of the process. Sometimes we have this idea that we run the show, we get so wrapped up in the God who died for us and loves us that somewhere along there we try to make him like subject to us. Like, not only is he chasing us down for salvation, but he's also going to bend over backwards. And it's like, well, now hold on. Now, he isn't being reconciled to us. We aren't looking over him, oh, God, you really messed up in the Old Testament. You got to fix things now. It's we are reconciled to him. To him. So there's a few things that are worth pointing out in this verse here, this verse 20. Through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether the things on earth. So it says there, if you just read the first part of the verse, it makes it sound like everything is going to be saved. And through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether the things on earth or things in heaven. That makes it sound like all will be saved, doesn't it? Well, then you read the second half of the verse, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So it's definitely not saying that all will be saved. The second half of the verse clearly clarifies and says, peace comes through his blood. By making peace through his blood. People will not be saved except through Christ. There is no universal salvation for everyone. But that also means that salvation is open to everybody, any who believe, through him to reconcile everything to himself. This is good news. Okay, what we want to say is it's only good news if everybody is going to heaven. Because for some reason we think we have to parent God. That's not the truth. Rather, anyone can be saved through Jesus. But it's open for anybody. So, in other words, there was a canyon between us that Christ reconciled. There was something separating us from God, and Jesus made a way for that. He built a bridge over it. And so by what Christ did, he brought peace with God from a war that we began. We were the ones who wronged God. We began the war against God. The whole problem originated with us. And Christ was the one who reconciled that. So another thing to point out, it says here, whether on earth or things in heaven, okay? Through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So something worth pointing, three things I want to point out from this. First off, it very clearly says not those things under the earth. It only says whether things on earth or things in heaven. And the reason for that is because people who die, and there's this teaching that goes around that, people in hell will be given another chance. Or maybe they were given another chance at some previous time. No. No. That's not how things work. It very clearly says earth or heaven, not under the earth. Fallen angels don't get a second chance. Those who have gone to punishment don't get a second chance. Then the second thing, it's talking about, in one way, it's talking about how the creation is going to be healed, how everything's going to be made right. So whether things on earth or things in heaven, okay, things are going to be made right. But there's also a deeper layer that is talking about here. Those who believe now on this earth and those who believed but died before. See, the Bible says that when we die, we are in heaven. That's it. So what about Christians right now? Let's say Isaiah's a Christian, okay? and he dies tonight. Where is he going to go? Where is he going to go to heaven? He doesn't go to some waiting place. And when he's in heaven, he will not have a resurrected body. He will be a spirit without a body. And then in the end, he will be given a resurrected body. After. Okay, right now, there are people who have died believing Christ who are in heaven. They do not have a body. They do not have the resurrected body. Right now, there are people who looked forward to the coming Christ before he came. When they died, they went to heaven. And they've been there ever since, waiting for the day of resurrection. Revelation gives us a clearer picture of this when it talks about the way that they're crying out to God night and day. How much longer? How much longer? So this is definitely, and Paul talks about the way that they are to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. This is where they are. So that's what he's talking about when he's saying here, whether things on earth or things in heaven. Those who are right now, he's reconciling, and also those who are waiting on the resurrected body. So some people might ask the question here, why is Christ exalted over the Father? How come if the name of Jesus is lifted up, people are saved, but not the Father? How come people put all the attention on Jesus, and like the Father and sometimes even the Holy Spirit just kind of become off to the side? That's not a very accurate understanding of the situation. So let me kind of bring some clarity here. When Jesus died, he reconciled us to the Father. When Jesus is glorified, the Father is glorified. See, because he reconciles us to the Father. Jesus isn't more God than the Father is. Does that make sense? There's a lot of different organizations that teach things like Jesus only, for instance, where it's like there's this misalignment of the Trinity. And the thing is here is that there's no rivalry between Jesus and the Father. There's no rivalry there. They had a singular purpose. The Father didn't have to like guilt trip Jesus into coming. He didn't have to like force him. Didn't have to force him to. They were in agreement. Okay, and there wasn't like something where the Father's like, no, I want to go instead, and Jesus is like, no, I want to go. You know, it wasn't like that. They were intent on their purpose. They were clear. There's no rivalry. And then second off, he was worthy. Jesus was worthy before he came to earth and died. Okay, so why does it talk about the way that he became worthy? Well, you could say it like this: he was worthy, but he earned what he deserved already. That would be a good way of saying it. Jesus was already God. He was already worthy, but he came and he lived and he inherited that which he already deserved. The difference, though, being is that he also inherited something that the Father did not. Now, I'm trying to say this very, very clearly. Jesus inherited the name Redeemer because he was the one of the Trinity that did the action. Okay, that doesn't mean that he's more God or less God. It doesn't mean that the Father is less exalted or anything like that. It is just an issue of who does what. And a way I could say this is, okay, I am Micah's dad, and Micah's my son. If I send Micah to clean Micah's room, does that make me any less the Father? No. Does it make him any more my son by obeying me? No. No. However, he was the one who did the action. So he would be called cleaner of room. Make sense? That's kind of the idea that's going on here. Okay, so there's no rivalry here. He was worthy, but he earned what he already deserved. And then third off, and I mentioned this before, becoming what he wasn't, he remained what he was. So Jesus was God already, but he became something that he wasn't before. And that is flesh, human, fully human. And then when he was resurrected, he will always now forever be human as well as fully God. When he went to heaven, he didn't lose his fully human state. He is always now, he has taken a part into himself that is now forever how that is. And of the Trinity, he's the only one who took on a human nature and kept it. Does that make sense? So, Becoming what he wasn't, he remained what he was. Fourth off, if you can make a promise but you don't fulfill the promise, what good is that? Think about this. Okay. I promise I'm going to tear out this stage and build another one, but then I never do it, right? So it's just a promise. What good is that promise? Well, not really worth anything. It's just an empty promise. So what Christ did is he brought the fulfillment of the promise. If he hadn't of, then God would have been a liar because he promised restoration to us. And if he didn't actually ever deliver on that, well, he wouldn't have been trustworthy. So God did this, and he proved his character, and he proved his promise. And so since Christ was the one who fulfilled the promise to restore, he is the one who gets the title. Make sense? I hope it does, because that's about the only way I know how to explain it, other than to say that there's no rivalry in the Trinity. And I don't know how else to say that. So this is what we've looked at tonight. We've started looking at the theology section. We haven't finished it. He goes on with the theology for quite a bit. And like I said, theology is just what to believe. That's all that it means, what we believe. That's it. And we looked at Jesus being the center. That takes us from verses 15 through 20. And I talked about the way that it was broken up into two different sections. Jesus over creation, verses 15 through 17, and Jesus over the church in verses 18 through 20. So in the next part, what's going to happen is that Paul is going to start tying it in with personal applications for family life and for Christian life. But right now, he's just trying to focus on correcting the beliefs themselves.